Thank you very much. Thank you for the warm welcome, and Andrew, thank you for the kind introduction. I also want to thank the Center for Strategic and International Studies for hosting us. Before I get to the topic at hand, the Russia threat in Europe, I also want to express briefly what I know is everyone's best wishes for a speedy recovery to my friend John McCain. I was as startled as any of you to learn about his hasty surgery over the weekend, but also as grateful as any of you to hear about the prediction of a full recovery. In the meantime, I guess this means I'm going to have to start raising twice as much hell in the Senate as I normally do to make up for John McCain's absence. But perhaps expressing best wishes for Senator McCain isn't a digression from the topic of Russia at all. After all, he never overlooked the threat that Russia poses to the West. Unlike many Western politicians for the last 17 years, Senator McCain clearly saw the K, the G, and the B in Vladimir Putin's eyes. For it's a serious mistake to think that the Cold War was sui generis. Yes, the Soviet Union layered an aggressive global ideology over the old Russia problem, but that problem remains with us today, as it always will be. It's far from a coincidence, I would suggest, that an old KGB officer took power in Russia less than a decade after the Soviet Empire disbanded. Therefore, the history of the Soviet era in U.S.-Russian relations remains vitally important today. And we're approaching a 30-year anniversary of a very important moment in that era, the ratification of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. 30 years on, it's still a remarkable achievement of President Reagan's statecraft. Not merely imposing numerical limits on weapon systems, but eliminating an entire class of weapons, namely land-based missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. Those missiles pose unusually high risks in Europe. They can be stockpiled and moved rapidly, making them difficult to monitor. And they cut warning time from launch down to just a few minutes, in contrast to intercontinental missiles. So it was deeply provocative when the Soviet Union deployed such missiles into Eastern Europe in the late 1970s. NATO had no choice but to respond. President Carter began the planning steps, and President Reagan carried them out by deploying American-built missiles to Europe in 1983. A decision, I should add, that was protested widely in the United States and Europe, protests that were funded in no small part by the KGB. For the next 4 years, the two sides jockeyed at the negotiating table until they finally reached an agreement. Today, Vladimir Putin and Russian strategic thinkers remain ambivalent about the INF Treaty, in my opinion. On the one hand, Russia benefits more from the INF Treaty than does the United States. After all, we don't worry about missile threats from Canada or Mexico. And the deployment of intermediate-range missiles to Cuba would plainly breach the understanding reached after the Cuban Missile Crisis that the United States will not accept offensive weapons stationed on that island. Russia, by contrast, is the vast land power of Eurasia, with potential rivals in close proximity. By eliminating these missiles from Europe, Russia gains security in the most likely theater of a general war from the superpower most capable of striking its territory, the United States. On the other hand, the INF Treaty applies only to the United States and Russia, so countries on the Eurasian perimeter, and here I speak in particular of China, have complete freedom to deploy intermediate-range missiles. Moreover, the lack of these missiles in Russia's arsenal deprives Russia of a potent tool to gain leverage in its near abroad, as it always seeks to do. Vladimir Putin has resolved this ambivalence in a simple way, cheating on the INF Treaty. By State Department accounts, Russia has been testing a new cruise missile that can strike Western Europe since at least 2008, at least 9 years. In fact, the Obama administration repeatedly warned the Kremlin to cease and desist. The State Department formally declared Russia in violation of the treaty in 2014 and every year thereafter. Yet, they never followed up in any meaningful way. So it's no surprise that, according to media reports, Russia has deployed 2 battalions of road-mobile, intermediate-range cruise missiles. Vladimir Putin is therefore eating his cake and getting to have it too. Russia remains secure in the European theater by the absence of U.S. cruise missiles, while Putin has developed a new missile that counteracts China, threatens the small countries on his periphery, and divides NATO politically. The truth is, though, this is nothing new for Russia, whether in the Soviet era or the Putin era. The Russians take a hard-eye view of the treaties they sign. Does a treaty serve their interests? If it does, then they abide by it. If it doesn't, then they don't. The Soviets signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 1972, for instance, because it served their interests. U.S. technology was more advanced, and if we developed an effective missile defense system, their nuclear deterrent wouldn't deter that much. But that didn't stop the Russians from pushing their luck. For years, they maintained a large phased array radar that plainly violated the ABM treaty. The U.S. protested until the Soviet Union finally agreed to dismantle that radar, 7 years after we first detected it. From their perspective, the treaty and this violation was a bargaining chip. To the Russians, any treaty is just another point of leverage, especially against NATO, not an inviolable commitment. I would suggest it's time we look at the INF Treaty in the same way. Beyond what our current commitments are, we should ask ourselves, what should they be? What set of commitments will protect our national security, and how should we adapt our current commitments to our current needs? For the time being, it's probably best to try to preserve the INF Treaty, but only if Russia comes back into compliance promptly and verifiably. But the only way to save the INF Treaty is to show the Russians that we will walk away from it if they don't come back into compliance. Putin's calculus is very simple. He gains more than he loses by violating the treaty. So we should reverse that calculus by making it more costly for the Russians to violate the treaty than to uphold its commitments. That's why I've introduced the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty Preservation Act, which would direct the Pentagon to take 4 immediate steps to apply pressure to Russia. First, develop a new intermediate range cruise missile backed up with $100 million in investment. Under the treaty, we cannot test, produce, or possess land-based intermediate range missiles, but we can conduct research on how to improve other missiles, such as extending their range or adapting them for different environments. For instance, we could develop a land-based version of the Tomahawk, which we usually launch from Navy ships. This kind of research stays well within the 4 corners of the INF Treaty, but also prepares us and our allies in case the treaty becomes obsolete. I'm pleased to say that the National Defense Authorization Act, recently voted out of the Armed Services Committee, includes $65 million for this program. I understand some of my Democratic colleagues intend to offer an amendment on the floor to remove this provision. I welcome, actually, I relish this debate on the Senate floor. We'll see how many of the Democrats who've discovered their inner cold warrior in the last 6 months are willing to put their money where their mouth is. Second, authorize $500 million in funding for developing new defense capabilities. To put it bluntly, if Russia is going to develop a new missile, then we should develop new ways to shoot it down. This would neutralize the advantage Russia seeks by violating the INF Treaty. For instance, we could speed up our deployment of sea and land-based missile defense sites. Third, facilitate the transfer of cruise missile technology to our allies. As I've noted, only the United States and Russia signed this treaty. No other country did. So even if we can't build intermediate range missiles, that doesn't mean our allies cannot. And it also doesn't mean that we cannot help them. For instance, the Polish government has been acquiring air-launched cruise missiles for some time. I suspect Warsaw might be interested in ground-launched cruise missiles as well, which I further suspect might make the Kremlin less keen on ripping up the INF treaty. Finally, we would present Russia with a very simple choice. Either you observe the INF treaty, or we won't renew our commitments to other treaties. Specifically, the legislation would prohibit further funding for two treaties that Russia wants to preserve. The first is an extension of the New START Treaty, which imposes greater limits on our strategic nuclear forces than on Russia's. The second is the Open Skies Treaty, which Russia needs more for overhead imagery intelligence than we do. If the Russians won't keep their INF commitments, why should the United States continue other treaties that benefit them? These proposals are sensible steps consistent with our treaty obligations and measured responses to Russian provocations. For we must remember, Russia's violations of the INF treaty aren't isolated, but rather part of a pattern of provocative behavior, whether it's annexing Crimea, or meddling in our elections, or assaulting our diplomats in Moscow, or harboring Edward Snowden, or buzzing American ships and aircraft, or giving aid to the Taliban, or providing the missiles that were used 3 years ago today to shoot a civilian aircraft out of the sky. Russia is deliberately probing our defenses all around the globe. They're looking for weak spots, which is why every provocation must be met with a firm and unyielding response. Put simply, we remain in strategic competition with Russia, and intermediate-range missiles are just one part of the central element of that competition: military modernization. Russia has engaged in a breakneck pace of modernization under Putin. It's essential that we modernize our military if we hope to maintain overmatch against Russia. Perhaps you've heard our Army generals say NATO is outgunned and outranged in Europe. Well, what they're talking about are the very weapon systems that are banned by the INF Treaty. So even if we do remain in the INF Treaty, we urgently need to modernize our military and especially the Army, which would do the brunt of any fighting in Europe. This is why the report being released by CSIS today is so important, and why I encourage everyone to read it carefully. Of course, we also have to remember that we're in strategic competition with countries besides Russia. The INF Treaty was a landmark agreement 30 years ago, but the world we now inhabit is very different from that world. For one thing, it's not a two-power world anymore. When Reagan and Gorbachev shook hands over the INF Treaty, China was beginning its free market reforms. Iran was locked in a war of attrition with Iraq. Neither India nor Pakistan was a nuclear power. And just 2 years before, hard as it may be to believe, North Korea had signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Thus, the time is coming to consider whether the United States should stay in the INF Treaty, even if Russia came back into compliance. As I've noted, no other country is a party to the treaty. As a result, our troops and our allies in the Asia-Pacific face an increasingly aggressive China, with more than 90% of its missile forces falling into the intermediate range. Yet Pacific Command and our allies lack a single ground-based intermediate-range missile to hold mainland China at risk. Though this question can be left to another day, the United States cannot afford to take a one-dimensional view of old treaties because the threats we face are no longer one-dimensional. What we certainly cannot afford is to stand by like chumps while Vladimir Putin cheats on the INF treaty openly and notoriously. Russia, as it always does, is consistently marshaling strategic advantage against the United States through a series of incremental provocations calculated to operate just below the threshold of retaliation. Deploying an intermediate-range cruise missile is perhaps the most provocative step as yet, because it would eventually allow Russia to hold all our bases, all our troops, and all our allies in Eurasia at risk. The time has come to put an end to this. If we cannot compel the bear to return to his den, we can at least lay painful traps in his path around the world. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator. That was a great way to kick us off. I thought I would start with a couple questions and then open it up to the audience from there. I thought I would really just, first of all, ask, because the Trump administration has a nuclear policy and a missile defense policy review going on, why shouldn't Congress just sort of sit back and kind of wait until that's all done before kind of moving forward with this legislation?
Well, first, I think what you'd find in that review is going to be similar to the proposals in our underlying legislation, as well as what the House and Senate Armed Services Committee have included in their versions of the National Defense Authorization Act. Second, these ideas do not come from me. This is a validated requirement that comes from military planners within the Department of Defense. And third, these reviews are important. They're valid, but we're 6 months on, and Congress needs to take its proper constitutional role in addressing some of the real challenges that we face from threats around the world.
Well, let me sort of stick with the executive-congressional relation there for a moment. Last week, the White House issued a statement of administration policy with respect to the House NDAA. And in terms, the INF Treaty Preservation Act provisions were mirrored in the House NDA in a couple ways, including with respect to the material breach declaration, and also in terms of a program of record, which you spoke about. Surprisingly enough, the White House Statement of Administration policy opposed those. And I wonder if you might speak to that. Do you think that's going to stick? How do you account for that? And do you think that administration opposition is likely to last?
Statement of Administration policy was crafted by Obama-era bureaucrats at the state and defense departments. I cannot imagine that when we pass this legislation, the president will oppose it, that H.R. McMaster would recommend that he veto it. I suspect, too, once Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis recognize the widespread support for these provisions, that they will likewise, reject the recommendations of those Obama-era bureaucrats. Remember, the program of record versus R&D is really just talking about how many defense planners can dance on the head of a pin. And second, material breach is short of calling Russia in complete abrogation of the treaty. It's an effort to bring Russia back into compliance with the treaty. So I expect wiser and tougher heads will prevail in the administration.
Okay, well, let me ask one more question, then open it up. You highlighted kind of the big thorny question of Russia politics and that kind of thing that's getting so much attention. And earlier this year, you asked at an open Senate Intelligence Committee hearing, you asked the director of the CIA if there was some reason to believe that Russia was using active measures or covert influence kind of to weigh in on our discussions here at home about nuclear modernization or missile defense. I'd be curious, kind of what was the impetus for that question? And is there some reason to believe that Russia is involved in that big discussion, just as they've been involved in so many other things?
Have you heard the parable of the scorpion and the frog?
Go for it.
So the scorpion asks the frog to take it across the river. The frog says, "You'll sting me if I do." And the scorpion says, "Why would I do that? We'd both die." Halfway across the river, the scorpion stings the frog, and the frog says, "Scorpion, why did you sting me? Now we'll both die." And the scorpion said, "Because it's in my nature." It's in Russia's nature to use deception, manipulation, subversion, subterfuge. If you read Bob Gates's first memoir, From the Shadows, he writes at length about the KGB's efforts to manipulate Western public opinion in Europe and the United States, about the very deployment of these intermediate-range cruise missiles in 1983. There was much Soviet money behind the mass protests you saw in the United States and Western Europe at the time. I know of no reason to believe that Russia is not doing the exact same thing right now to try to stop the modernization of our nuclear triad or to stop the deployment of advanced weapon systems to its periphery. It is simply what Russia does. Remember, Russia is a country that now has a GDP barely or less than 10% of American GDP. GDP smaller than the size of California, smaller than Texas, smaller than New York, smaller than Italy, actually 2/3 the size of Italy, smaller than the combined GDP of the 5 Nordic countries. They have to find ways to achieve strategic advantage that is not going to depend on marshaling vast resources. And what they call active measure campaigns, what we would call propaganda or covert influence, is one of the ways that Russia, whether in the Soviet era or in the Putin era, has long attempted to achieve that advantage by molding Western opinion and dividing NATO countries between themselves.
Great. Well, why don't we open up to the floor, I think, and since this is about Army modernization, I'll throw it to Andrew to get us started. Good. And for other folks, just wait for the microphone and identify yourself and keep it in the form of a question.
Well, Senator, thank you for those remarks. You obviously illustrated in your speech and made reference also to Army leadership comments about the Army being outranged, outgunned in Europe, and increasingly so. Your Senate Armed Services Committee, Mark, and the Airland piece went after this, did some increased modernization for the Army. My question is, because there's so many things that you can increase or seek to accelerate in the Army's modernization program, everything pretty much is been at a standstill for some time. How did you prioritize, and what did you find to be the most compelling case to make to your colleagues for why specific forms of Army modernization are needed now?
Well, so first off, I understand the point that General Milley, the Chief of Staff of the Army, makes about readiness having to come before modernization. We cannot send our sons and daughters today into combat without them being fully prepared, trained, and equipped. However, modernization is tomorrow's readiness. And I can look any mother or father in Arkansas in the eye and tell them that the Army would not put their son or daughter in combat today without being fully prepared, trained, equipped. If a parent of an 8-year-old asks me that, I'm not sure I can say the same thing. So while readiness is urgent, modernization, though, can't be minimized. Second, Army has a somewhat tougher case to make on modernization than does the Air Force or the Navy. That's not unique to this administration or this Army leadership. It's relatively simple to explain why you need to modernize ships or aircraft or weapons or missiles. They're big. They exist in a comprehensible sense. We talk about the 355 ship Navy or 100 of the B-21 bombers and so forth. That's the thing that any kind of layman can get his hands around about the need for stealth aircraft and so forth. Army systems are a little bit harder to get your hands around, and the nature of a brigade combat team is harder for for a layman to get his or her hands around as well. But the point we've made to our colleagues, and I know there are some war games out there that some of you have probably seen, is that absent much greater and quicker investments in both readiness on the front end, but modernization in the medium term, that we will no longer have overmatch against countries like Russia in the European theater. And any effort to, or any kind of major mechanized war on land, which I know everybody says we're never going to be fighting on, but we're fighting on land everywhere, we're fighting about land everywhere, would pose serious risks to our soldiers and to our national security. So it's a little bit harder case to make just on a layman's terms than it is for the Air Force or the Navy, but it's certainly an urgent case to make.
All right, well, why don't we get a few more? We'll start with Sydney, and then we'll keep your hands up, and I'll get a few more.
Hi, Senator Sidney Friedberg from Breaking Defense. To address the large and odorous elephant in the room, you have talked about the importance of understanding that Russia is a strategic competitor, that they are relentless, that they seek to influence our domestic political debates. But there are lots of signs that this administration has been dangerously naive on that front. Be it, wouldn't suggest there's collusion in the campaign. I don't see any proof of that so far. But being willing to meet with people who, not realizing they are Russian intelligence cutouts, being willing to say, oh, we can work with these people, or even form a joint cyber unit. I mean, even if it doesn't come to pass, that seems to suggest a lack of the appreciation of the danger that you suggest. How comfortable are you, how confident are you this administration understands the danger and the realpolitik that you describe?
Some of your comments fall within the scope of our review on the Senate Intelligence Committee or within Director Mueller's investigation, so I'll leave it to those matters and won't comment further on that. But I would dispute the premise of the question that the Trump administration has somehow been soft on Russia. If anything, the Trump administration has been much tougher on Russia. Was it collusion when Barack Obama told Dmitry Medvedev that I'll have more flexibility to deal with missile defenses after the election? Was it naivete when Hillary Clinton pressed the reset button with Sergei Lavrov 6 months after Russia invaded Georgia? Was it appalling naivete and weakness when Barack Obama directed our ambassador in Ukraine, as their country was being invaded, to tell the government of that country to do nothing provocative to stop the Russians? By contrast, look at what this administration has done. Put it simply, look at some of the people they've appointed to their to high office, whether it's Jim Mattis or Mike Pompeo or H.R. McMaster, or just shortly after the bilateral meeting in Hamburg, Kurt Volker. I know many of you probably know Ambassador Volker. I don't think anyone would accuse him of being someone who's naive or confused about Russia's ambitions in the world. Look at what Donald Trump campaigned on. Investing more in our defenses, expanding missile defenses, accelerating nuclear modernization, pumping more American oil and gas. None of those things look very good if you're sitting in the Kremlin. None of those things were supported by Hillary Clinton or most Democrats in the campaign either. We've struck their main client in Syria, wrong-footing Vladimir Putin, showing that they can't protect that client. We're starting to take a tougher line on Iran. We're continuing and expanding the European Reassurance Initiative, which I hasten to add, it's regrettable that we had to start something called the Reassurance Initiative after 8 years of the Obama administration. So I have to dispute the premise of the question that the Trump administration 6 months in has been anything other than tougher on Russia when it comes to the real world.
All right, I see a question right here in front.
Hi, I'm Hank Gaffney, worked in ISA and then at the Center for Naval Analyses, and I set up the process and laid out the options which led to Euro missiles and thus to the INF. And later on, in '98, I got to visit a former SS-20 base. By the way, there were no SS-20s deployed in East Europe. They were deployed all across the Soviet Union. And I got to kick the tires of its replacement, the SS-25, there at the former SS-20 base. Thank God it was aimed only at the US, not Europe. I also studied lots of the Russian missile, ballistic missile programs. And of course, this cruise missile is to be mounted on the Iskander transporter. And I never found any evidence that the Iskander was nuclear. Do you know that this cruise missile is nuclear? In fact, I found opposite views on the inutility of nuclear weapons.
So I don't want to comment on the intelligence about this particular weapon system that's been widely reported in the Western media. I will say, however, that the destabilizing nature of intermediate range missiles in Europe is not limited to nuclear missiles. It's also the case that any other kind of high explosive warhead could be inherently destabilizing Europe as well. That's why Russia, in its Soviet form, wanted to eliminate the entire class of weapons, not just simply limit the number of those weapons.
Okay, who else? Saw a few more up. Yep, two over here. Start with the front row. By the way.
Hi, Katalin inside the Army. Do you think you could just speak a little bit generally on your opinion on the Army's current modernization efforts, and if you think that they have the right focus moving forward? What are some things that you think they should be focusing more on?
Need to move faster need to be clear about priorities. Some of those priorities, as I mentioned in my speech, are currently prohibited by treaty obligation, but we need to be prepared to move quickly should that treaty become obsolete. In the meantime, we should do everything we can within the context of our obligations internationally to increase the lethality and the survivability of all of our land-based systems, whether that's active armor systems or increasing the size of cannons or what have you. In addition, we simply need to expand the end strength of our military, or of our Army in particular.
Thank you. You spoke of assisting U.S. allies with developing the weapons that the INF prohibits the U.S. from doing. Wouldn't that sort of be going around the treaty and ignoring the principle of it?
Well, Vladimir Putin is violating the letter of it, so if someone accuses the United States of violating the spirit, I'm not that terribly concerned about it.
Okay, and then real quick, would it be possible or a better step to possibly renegotiate the treaty, given that, like you said, it is 30 years old and times have changed at this point?
We should certainly not renegotiate a treaty from a position of weakness where our only counterparty in the treaty is violating the treaty and can therefore dictate the terms that they want to impose on us. That's why the right posture now is to put greater pressure on Russia to come back into compliance with the treaty. Should they not do that, then obviously we should not remain in a treaty where we become literally the only country on earth that refrains from building a particular kinds of weapon system.
Okay, good. I saw one over here, right here, this gentleman, and then one in the back. But let's start here.
Senator Cotton, Greg Helman with Politico. You referenced in your speech the fact that China, which is not a party to the INF treaty, it has developed cruise missiles that would be in violation of this treaty, regardless of our participation. So I'm curious if you think there are steps the United States should be taking to respond to the threat of Chinese cruise missiles that outside of leaving the treaty.
Well, it's difficult for the United States to fault a nation that's not committed by treaty for developing weapon systems that would be banned by that treaty. What the United States should be doing, though, is taking a much firmer line with China in all manners of interactions to put more pressure on China to stop its aggressive behavior in the Asia-Pacific. So, North Korea is in the headlines a lot today. There's still vast scope of pressure that we can bring to bear on China that if they don't help us with the North Korea problem more, they'll feel some pain. We should be much more active in the South China Sea to make it clear that we're going to work with the other nations who are our allies on the littoral of that sea to prevent China from militarizing it and dominating it. The NDAA also includes several measures designed to bolster Taiwan's defenses or to push back on China's campaign of international isolation against Taiwan. If it passes as it's written on the committee, the National Defense Authorization Act will probably be the most pro-Taiwan piece of legislation since the Taiwan Relations Act. Those are just a few examples of things that we can do to take a firmer hand with China, which we certainly should do.
Okay, I saw right in the back here, this one.
I'm Nana Sajaya from the Voice of America Georgian Service. Senator, in 2008 NATO Bucharest summit, there was a promise made that Georgia and Ukraine one day would become NATO members, and a lot has changed since that. 20% of Georgia is still occupied and Crimea is annexed. Do you see it's plausible to see anytime soon NATO extended in Eastern Europe? And the follow-up question would be, are you worried about Russia's attempts to destabilize the region and to bolster anti-American, anti-Western attitudes, especially in its neighborhood?
Well, at the moment, it's not obvious the path that Georgia and Ukraine would take into NATO while they still have Russian troops on their soil. So our immediate objective should be to bring enough pressure to bear on Russia that they leave those lands, that they give back Crimea to Ukraine and leave eastern Ukraine and northern Georgia. Secretary Tillerson, coming out of the bilateral meeting in Hamburg, was very clear that the sanctions we've put in place on Russia, relatively tepid and ineffective though they've been, will remain in place as long as there are Russian troops and Russian-backed rebels on Ukrainian soil. The second part of your question, of course, Russia is trying to destabilize and divide the West. Again, that's what they've been doing for decades, not just in the Soviet era, but in the Putin era as well, which I, again, would suggest to have a lot more historical continuity than discontinuity between them. They did it in 1983 when they helped fund those massive protests against the deployment of INF forces to Europe. They're doing it today in elections in Western Europe, in our election here. They're doing it through snap military exercises or increasingly bellicose rhetoric. This is simply what Russia does, and that's why we have to meet these kind of provocations with a firm and unyielding response.
Okay, who else? Actually, we haven't taken any from over here, so I see one in the front and then one in the middle.
Sir, Max Mueller, State Department. So you mentioned possibly dropping the INF if that's in U.S. interest. Do you see it possible to eliminate the INF and, more or less start an arms race in Europe and also reassure our allies and not create additional fractionalism?
What was the last part of your question?
Do you see it possible to eliminate the INF and also reassure our allies and not create additional fractionalism in NATO?
So currently, the INF is breached by Russia, and the one situation we cannot tolerate is that Russia remains in violation of the treaty while the United States remains the only country in the United States that refrains from building a potent weapon system. Several generals have testified in Congress that they see no reason to believe Congress will come back into compliance. If the current state of affairs remains the same, I agree. That's why my legislation is designed to put pressure on Russia to come back into compliance. If they do not, or even if, given the shifting nature of global strategic competition, we decide it's in our interest to no longer be a part of that treaty, then yes, we should withdraw from it. We haven't reached that point yet, but I suspect we will sooner rather than later. As for the European divide, look, the Europeans are always divided to a degree. They're divided in part because the Russians use subterfuge and deception and espionage to keep them divided. There are some European countries that strongly oppose President Carter and President Reagan's decision to deploy INF forces in the late 70s and the early 1980s, but it actually turned out pretty well. There are other European countries that strongly supported it. It's a matter of it's for U.S. diplomacy to try to maintain political unity among our NATO allies when confronted with such a serious threat as Russia deploying once again cruise missiles that can strike all of Europe.
Okay. And I saw the gentleman in the middle over here. Right.
Stanley Kober, how do you propose to pay for all this increased spending? Either you increase taxes or you cut other commitments, other spending elsewhere. So you seem to be suggesting much increased spending for defense, or do I have that incorrect?
Well, so on the specific points that I've mentioned in my legislation, we're talking about defense spending on the magnitude of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. That'll be offset through other defense accounts. On the broader point about military modernization, yes, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars, and in the long term, hundreds of billions of dollars spread out over the coming decades. I would argue very simply that our defense spending is not what drives our deficits. It's not what drives our long-term debt. If anything, it helps control long-term debt because it assures the safety and the security of American interests around the world. We are a global power with global trading interests. Therefore, we have a keen interest in global order. And our defense spending has never been a driver of our deficit. It actually, in the long term, helps control it by keeping peace and stability throughout the world to help keep our economy growing and healthy and to avoid the depredations of a general war. What really drives our deficits are long-term health and retirement programs as well as weak economic growth of the last 10 years. So we can attack that from the growth side by trying to get our economy growing at a faster pace, more people back to work. And in the long term, we have to address the solvency of our health care and retirement programs. Those provide an important social safety net, but they're also rapidly running out of money in the near term, in the next 8 to 12 years or so. But ultimately, our defense budget is not what drives our debt, and in fact, anytime you try to balance the budget on the back of defense, you end up spending more than you would have in the long run because your adversaries catch up with you, and then you have to invest in a crash course of reinvesting in capabilities that have withered.
So you left off there with kind of the question of adversaries getting closer to our capabilities. And in your remarks, you talked about kind of the problem of overmatch. Let me kind of connect a couple of the things here. The provision of your bill that calls for more missile defense, including cruise missile defense against both INF non-compliant cruise missiles and others as well, and also kind of, you might say, theater missile defense for Europe. Let me kind of connect that with the other side here, and that's Army modernization. The Army's out there with this multi-domain battle thing, which seems to be a lot about, kind of bringing the Army up in a more agile way to near-peer threats. And yet, our air and missile defenses are in many ways retarded by a lack of modernization for many years. Do you want to kind of speak to that, about what we kind of need to get for moving from the Patriots and such of today to something capable of handling these things?
Yeah, it's an important challenge. The Army often goes through these cycles where it thinks we're going to get to fight a war the way we like to fight it, or we're going to be able to dictate the terms on which the war is fought. Our enemies always seem to have a way of refusing to take guidance on how they should be fighting. So for many years in the Cold War and then after the Persian Gulf War, we were focused on heavy mechanized warfare against peer competitors. We didn't do much on counterinsurgency, something that the Army had learned to do back in the Vietnam era. Obviously, we had to rapidly shift in the middle part of the last decade to learning more about how to do counterinsurgency effectively, and we did it pretty effectively in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially during the surge era of both of those wars. However, we've now been 16 years in which we don't have an adversary with air power, in which we have complete air dominance. It's understandable that Army commanders fighting a war that is where you have air dominance against guerrillas and insurgents would oftentimes be neglecting combined arms fire or air defense, that planners would be neglecting investment in those capabilities. But as we've seen just in the last 8 years, but especially the last 16 years, how rapidly the threat environment has shifted as China and Russia both have increased the pace of military modernization, especially the pace of military modernization designed to keep us from ever fighting a war against them like we fought against Iraq in 1991. So these are really urgent priorities that the Army needs to address and that Congress needs to provide the money for them to address.
Yeah, good. All right, who else? Right here in the front. While she's coming up, I'll just say that the Army identified the need for a 360-degree sensor for cruise missiles, these new things called cruise missiles, back in 1993, a quarter century ago, and we still don't have it. Yes, sir.
My name is Zane Mitchell, and my question is, should the United States consider adding other countries to the INF treaty in order to prevent Russia from establishing, for lack of a better term, proxies to develop their land-based missiles at?
Well, the first prerequisite for any future for the INF treaty is for Russia to come into prompt and verifiable compliance. Should that happen, then you put Vladimir Putin and Russia back in the position that I mentioned in my speech, that they are surrounded by countries that have the capability of striking Russian territory with intermediate range missiles, and they might have an interest in that scenario of working with the United States and those countries on its periphery to add other countries to the INF treaty. Do I think that's probable? No. But the immediate prerequisite for any kind of future of a multilateral INF treaty is for Russia to come back into compliance with the treaty.
Good. Okay, we have probably time for two more, and then we have to take a quick break before the panel. So who else? Got one up here. Folks want to bring it up here? Right here, right here.
Hi, Connie again. Sort of going back to the budget issue, do you have an opinion on Congressman Thornberry's whole OCA reform effort with moving lots of money into the base budget and breaking BCA caps? Does that concern you at all, or do you think?
So the Budget Control Act must be repealed. It was passed as Congress was rushing out of town in the summer of 2011 to increase the debt ceiling and get on to the August recess. It was designed to constrain spending. It did briefly for a couple years, although I would say that's probably has much to do with a new Republican Congress after $1 trillion deficits in the early Obama era than it was the Budget Control Act. Congress has proven itself, though, incapable of adhering to the Budget Control Act caps. In 2013, we got a continuing resolution in September, a two-year budget in the fall, an omnibus in December, and another omnibus in December of 14. That's exactly what happened in 2015 and 2016. Today, it's the middle of July. It looks like we're heading towards a continuing resolution in September, some kind of 2-year budget deal in the fall that doesn't constrain spending, an omnibus spending bill in December, and another omnibus spending bill in December of 2018. And then we'll top off that sorry history with the same 2-year scenario playing out in 2019 and 2020. The Budget Control Act is not the Constitution, and the 112th Congress was not the Constitutional Convention. So we should simply repeal it outright, and Congress should do its job to set priorities with taxpayer dollars on a year-to-year basis. And if the Republican Party, the party that's always stood for strong national defense, in an environment where the Budget Control Act has been repealed, can't invest more in our defense capabilities, then bad for us. But the Budget Control Act must be repealed.
What's it going to take to get to that? From where we are today, out of this cycle of CRs to that repeal, what's it going to take?
I believe you probably have the votes right now in the Senate to repeal the Budget Control Act. I suspect almost every Democrat, if not all of them, would vote to repeal it, and at least half of my Republican colleagues would vote as well. In the House of Representatives, I think opinion is more divided among Republicans, but also deficit hawks in the House know that history I just laid out. They have no reason to believe that we're magically going to adhere to those caps this year. The Democrats are going to willingly agree to reduce domestic spending and shift that money into defense spending when they have the status quo working in their favor, which is draconian budget cuts on a 50-50 basis into the defense budget, which only accounts for 20% of federal spending. So, I mean, the Democrats would like to see it repealed as well because they want to see more spending on departments like housing and urban development and commerce and so on and so forth. So I think you have the votes in the Senate, and I think with some work and the administration support, you could get the votes in the House as well. Again, just because you repeal the Budget Control Act doesn't mean spending go up. I mean, I know the Congressional Budget Office may say spending goes up when you repeal the Budget Control Act, but the Congressional Budget Office says a lot of things that just aren't so. And just like every year, we worried for 17 years about paying for the so-called doc fix, which were reductions in the rates of reimbursement to doctors using Medicare, and every year we found a way to push those off, and we finally ripped off the Band-Aid. We should do the same thing with the Budget Control Act, because we know that those across-the-board cuts are not going to go into effect if passed as any prologue, and there's no reason to think the 115th Congress is going to be any different from the 114th or the 113th.
Good. All right, one last question, and we'll take it right over here.
Thank you. Nicole Alt with the Washington Times. I'm just curious what kind of timeline specifically you see for going forward with this, with bringing Russia into compliance or otherwise eliminating the treaty or considering other options before we have some kind of disaster on our hands, and specifically what might the consequences be if we don't move forward with this quickly?
Well, the provisions in the National Defense Authorization Act, which have the support of both Republicans and the Democrats, would be enacted into law later this year. That bill has passed every year for over 50 years. There's no reason to think it won't pass this year. There's no reason to think those provisions won't survive. So on that time frame, you're talking about a matter of months, not years. I would encourage the administration to take every action it can as well to put more pressure on Russia to bring it back into compliance. Right now, we have many European partners who want to play like ostriches, stick their head in the sands, and pretend that Russia doesn't have this system because they don't want to face the consequences of making that announcement. I would encourage those European partners to face reality. Pretending Russia doesn't have a cruise missile that can strike their territory, especially if it's based in Kaliningrad, is not going to eliminate the threat to their citizens. As is always the case, bad news doesn't get better with time. So we should all face up to the challenge that this missile system poses to us and take the steps necessary to bring Russia back into compliance, or take the steps necessary to counteract and defeat that threat.
Well, Senator, thank you for coming out today, and thanks for your leadership on these issues. Please join me in welcoming. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Appreciate it.